The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming plains as Jacob Morrison checked his cattle near the stream that bordered his property. The 42-year-old rancher had built his modest spread from nothing over the past 15 years, working the land with calloused hands and an unwavering determination that had seen him through drought, harsh winters, and the constant threat of cattle rustlers. As he rode his bay mare along the fence line, Jacob noticed something unusual near the old oak tree that marked the eastern boundary of his land. A figure crouched behind the massive trunk, partially hidden by the morning mist that still clung to the ground. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle secured to his saddle, but something about the way the person was positioned made him pause. Drawing closer, Jacob could see it was a young woman, her dark hair braided and adorned with small beads that caught the early light. Her buckskin dress was torn in several places, and dried blood stained the fabric near her shoulder. She clutched a small bundle to her chest and kept looking back toward the hills from where she had obviously come. The woman noticed his approach and sprang to her feet, her dark eyes wide with fear. She couldn't have been more than 18, Jacob estimated, with the delicate features and copper skin that marked her as one of the Lakota people who had lived in these lands long before white settlers arrived. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, like a deer caught in an open meadow. "Please," she said in accented English, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is it all right if I remain here until those marauders move on?" Her words carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned the language as a second tongue, each syllable measured and precise. The rancher just nodded, she added hopefully, gesturing toward Jacob as if seeking confirmation of her request. Jacob dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. In the 15 years he had worked this land, he had encountered many Lakota people, and most interactions had been peaceful. Trade was common, and he had learned enough of their language to conduct basic business. But this young woman was clearly in distress, running from something that had left her injured and terrified. "You're hurt," he observed, nodding toward her shoulder where the blood had seeped through her dress. "What happened to you?" The girl's grip tightened on her bundle, and Jacob could see now that it contained what appeared to be personal belongings wrapped in a colorful blanket. Her eyes darted once more toward the hills before she spoke. "Bad men came to our camp 3 days ago," she explained, her voice gaining strength as she realized Jacob meant her no harm. "They were not soldiers, but white men with guns and whiskey breath. They said they were looking for horses, but they took more than horses." Her jaw tightened with barely controlled emotion. "They took my sister." Jacob felt a familiar anger rise in his chest. He had heard stories of rogue bands of men who preyed on isolated Indian camps, taking what they wanted and leaving destruction in their wake. These were not official military actions, but the work of outlaws and opportunists who saw the ongoing conflicts as cover for their crimes. "How many men?" he asked, already mentally cataloging the weapons he had back at the house. 7 or 8, she replied. "They have many guns and horses. When they took my sister, I tried to follow, but they saw me. I have been running since yesterday morning." She touched her shoulder gingerly. "One of them shot at me when I would not tell them where other camps might be." Jacob studied the young woman's face, seeing the exhaustion and pain she was trying to hide. Her courage impressed him. Not many people would have attempted to follow armed men to rescue a family member. The fact that she had made it this far while injured spoke to both her determination and her knowledge of the land. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Ayanna," she replied, which Jacob knew meant eternal blossom in Lakota. "My English name is Sarah, but my family calls me Ayanna." "I'm Jacob Morrison," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "This is my land, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But if these men are still looking for you, my ranch might not be the safest place. They could follow your trail here. Ayana's shoulders sagged slightly, and Jacob could see the weight of despair settling over her. She had been hoping for sanctuary, but now faced the reality that her presence might bring danger to her only potential ally. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted. "My father and brothers went on a hunting trip to the Black Hills. They will not return for many weeks. The other camps are too far, and I do not know if these bad men have found them too." Jacob made his decision quickly, as was his nature. He had not survived on the frontier by hesitating when action was needed. "Come with me to the house," he said. "We'll get that shoulder looked at, and you can rest while we figure out what to do about your sister." As they walked toward his modest ranch house, with Jacob leading his horse and Ayana walking beside him, he couldn't help but notice how she moved despite her injury. There was a grace to her step that spoke of someone raised in harmony with the natural world, someone who could read the land and weather with an intuition that most white settlers never developed. The house came into view as they crested a small rise. It was a simple structure built of logs and stone, with a covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that Mrs. Chen, his elderly Chinese housekeeper, was already preparing the morning meal. Jacob had hired the woman 2 years earlier when she had arrived in town with nowhere to go, her husband having died during the construction of the railroad. She was a practical woman who asked few questions and had proven invaluable in managing the household. "Mrs. Chen will help with your shoulder," Jacob explained as they approached the house. "She has experience with injuries from her time in the mining camps." Ayana nodded but remained alert, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The bundle in her arms seemed to be her only remaining link to her former life. And Jacob wondered what precious items it contained that she had chosen to save when forced to flee. As they reached the porch, Jacob called out to announce their arrival. The door opened to reveal a small, weathered woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Mrs. Chen took in the scene with a quick glance, her experienced eyes noting Ayana's injury and exhausted state. "Bring her inside," Mrs. Chen said without preamble. "I will prepare medicine and food." The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture and colorful rugs that Mrs. Chen had woven during the long winter evenings. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting warm light across the main room that served as both kitchen and living area. Ayana hesitated at the threshold, her cultural upbringing making her cautious about entering the home of strangers. Jacob sensed her reluctance and stepped aside to let her enter at her own pace. "You're safe here," he assured her. "Mrs. Chen is a good woman and she'll take care of your wound." As Ayana finally stepped inside, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that her arrival marked the beginning of something significant. The frontier was changing, and the old ways of life were disappearing with each passing year. Perhaps in helping this young woman, he might find some way to bridge the growing divide between the worlds that were colliding across the American West. Outside, the wind began to pick up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant sound of thunder. Jacob looked toward the hills where Ayana had emerged, wondering how long it would be before the marauders she spoke of appeared on his horizon. He had faced many challenges in his years on the ranch, but something told him that the greatest test of his character and convictions was yet to come. Mrs. Chen worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning and dressing Ayana's shoulder wound while the young Lakota woman sat stoically in the kitchen chair. The bullet had grazed the muscle without hitting bone, but the wound needed proper care to prevent infection. As she worked, Mrs. Chen hummed softly, a tune from her homeland that seemed to calm both herself and her patient. Jacob stood by the window, periodically scanning the landscape for any signs of approaching riders. The storm clouds were gathering more quickly now, and he could feel the change in air pressure that preceded the violent thunderstorms common to this region. If the marauders were indeed tracking Ayanna, the approaching weather might provide both concealment and complications. "Tell me more about these men who took your sister," Jacob said, turning from the window. "Did you recognize any of them? Had they been to your camp before?" Ayanna winced as Mrs. Chen applied a poultice to her wound, but her voice remained steady. "The leader had a scar across his cheek here," she said, drawing a line from her left ear to the corner of her mouth. "He spoke some Lakota words, but badly. He knew our customs enough to know that taking young women would bring shame and anger to our people." "That suggests he's been in contact with your people before," Jacob observed. "Maybe trading or scouting for the army?" "He was not army," Ayanna said firmly. "Army men wear uniforms and follow rules, even when they are our enemies. These men were different. They enjoyed the fear they caused. The scarred man laughed when the children cried." Mrs. Chen finished bandaging the wound and began preparing a meal of beef stew and cornbread. The aromatic steam filled the small kitchen, and Jacob noticed how Ayanna's eyes followed the preparation hungrily. She had likely eaten very little during her flight from the marauders. "My sister's name is Winona," Ayanna continued unprompted. "She is only 15 summers old, but she is beautiful and kind. She was promised to marry Standing Bear's son when he returns from his vision quest." Her voice caught slightly. "If those men harm her, it will destroy more than just her life. It will break the engagement and bring dishonor to both families." Jacob understood the implications. In Lakota culture, as in many frontier communities, a woman's reputation was fragile and precious. The shame of what might happen to Winona would extend far beyond her personal suffering. It was a weapon that cruel men used deliberately, knowing that the damage would ripple through entire communities. "Do you know where they might have taken her?" he asked. "There is an old trading post about 2 days' ride north of here," Ayanna replied. "It has been abandoned for years, but the buildings still stand. My grandmother told stories of bad things that happened there in the old days. It would be a place where such men might feel comfortable." Jacob knew the place she meant. He had ridden past it several times over the years, noting the deteriorating buildings and overgrown paths. It was isolated enough to provide privacy for illegal activities, yet close enough to established trails that it wouldn't be completely inaccessible. If he were a criminal looking for a temporary hideout, it would indeed be an ideal location. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caused all 3 occupants of the house to freeze. Jacob moved quickly to the window, peering through the curtains at the riders approaching from the east. 4 men on horseback were moving at a steady pace toward the ranch, their weapons clearly visible even at a distance. "Stay here and keep low," Jacob instructed Ayanna and Mrs. Chen as he retrieved his rifle from above the fireplace mantel. "Mrs. Chen, take her to the back room and don't come out unless I call for you." Ayanna started to protest, but Jacob held up his hand. "If these are the men hunting you, I need to handle this carefully. If they think you're here and I'm hiding you, they might decide to take what they want by force." The older Chinese woman nodded and quietly led Ayanna toward the small bedroom at the back of the house. Jacob checked his rifle and moved to the front door, positioning himself where he could see the approaching riders while remaining partially concealed. The men who rode into his yard were exactly what he had expected based on Ayanna's description. Rough, unshaven, and heavily armed, they had the look of men who lived outside the law. Their clothes were a mixture of military surplus and civilian wear, suggesting they might be deserters or former soldiers turned outlaw. The leader, a tall man with the promised scar across his left cheek, dismounted and approached the porch with the swagger of someone accustomed to intimidating others. "Afternoon," the scarred man called out, touching his hat brim in a mockery of politeness. "Name's Crawford. We're tracking some stolen horses through this area. Wondered if you might have seen anything unusual." Jacob stepped onto the porch, keeping his rifle visible, but not immediately threatening. "This is private property. he replied evenly. "I haven't seen any horses that don't belong to me." Crawford's eyes swept the ranch buildings, taking in the corral with Jacob's horses, the barn, and the house itself. "Funny thing about these particular horses," he said with a cold smile. "They belonged to some Indians we encountered a few days back. Had to teach them a lesson about respecting white folks' property rights." "I don't involve myself in other people's business," Jacob replied, though every instinct told him to put a bullet in this man immediately. "Now I'll ask you to move along." One of Crawford's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "We saw smoke from your chimney and thought maybe you'd offered hospitality to someone passing through. Being neighborly and all." The implication was clear. They suspected that Ayanna might have sought refuge here, and they were fishing for information. Jacob knew that his next words would determine whether this encounter ended peacefully or in violence. "I offer hospitality to folks who deserve it," Jacob said carefully. "But I haven't had any visitors recently except for my neighbor stopping by yesterday to borrow some tools." Crawford studied Jacob's face intently, looking for signs of deception. The scarred man had obviously developed skills in reading people during his criminal career, and Jacob could feel the weight of that scrutiny. "Mind if we water our horses at your well?" Crawford asked, though his tone made it clear this wasn't really a request. "It's been a long ride, and we've got a longer one ahead of us." Jacob nodded toward the well near the barn. "Help yourself, but make it quick. I've got work to do." As the men moved toward the well, Jacob noticed that one of them remained mounted and positioned where he could watch both the house and his companions. These were experienced men who knew how to work together, which made them more dangerous than simple, opportunistic criminals. While the horses drank, Crawford continued his probing. "You know, we heard tell of an Indian girl who might be wandering around these parts. Young thing, probably hurt and scared. We're concerned for her safety, what with all the wild animals and such." The lie was so transparent that Jacob almost laughed. "Like I said, I haven't seen anyone." "Course, if someone was helping her hide from lawful pursuit," Crawford continued, his hand resting casually on his pistol grip, "that might be considered aiding and abetting. Could cause problems for an honest rancher trying to make a living." Jacob felt his anger rising, but kept his voice level. "Are you threatening me on my own property?" "Just making conversation," Crawford replied with a shrug. "But you understand how things work out here. Sometimes a man's neighbors might start wondering about his loyalties if he's not careful about the company he keeps." The threat was clear enough. If Jacob didn't cooperate, Crawford and his men might spread word that the rancher was harboring Indians or sympathizing with the wrong people. In a region where tensions between settlers and native tribes ran high, such rumors could be devastating to a man's livelihood and safety. Thunder rumbled overhead as the storm clouds continued to gather. The first fat raindrops began to fall, creating small puffs of dust where they struck the dry earth. Crawford looked up at the darkening sky and seemed to make a decision. "Well, I reckon we better be moving along before this storm hits," he said, swinging back into his saddle. "But we'll be keeping an eye on this area for the next few days. That Indian girl is bound to turn up somewhere, and when she does, we'll find her." As the men rode away, Jacob remained on the porch until they disappeared over the ridge to the west. Only then did he allow himself to breathe normally again. The encounter had been a test, and while he had passed it for now, he knew that Crawford suspected something. The scarred man would be back, probably with more men and less patience for polite conversation. When he was certain the riders were gone, Jacob called softly to Mrs. Chen and Ayanna. The two women emerged from the back room, both looking tense but relieved. "They will return," Ayanna said simply. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "Yes," Jacob agreed. "And next time, they won't be as polite about searching the place." Mrs. Chen began serving the stew she had prepared. But the mood in the small kitchen had changed. The immediate danger had passed, but the larger threat remained. Somewhere to the north, Winona was being held by men who would not hesitate to use violence to achieve their goals. And here in Jacob's house, her sister waited for a rescue that seemed increasingly impossible. As the first real thunderclap shook the house, Jacob began to formulate a plan. It would be dangerous, possibly suicidal, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing while an innocent girl suffered at the hands of Crawford and his gang. The storm might actually provide the cover he needed if he was willing to take the risk. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the windows and roof with increasing intensity. Jacob watched the water run down the glass and wondered if he was about to make the best or worst decision of his life. The storm raged through the night, providing Jacob with the cover he needed to put his desperate plan into action. While Ayanna slept fitfully in the back room and Mrs. Chen maintained watch by the window, Jacob prepared for what might be his final ride. He cleaned his weapons methodically, checked his ammunition, and packed supplies that would sustain him during the dangerous journey ahead. As dawn broke gray and wet, Jacob found Ayanna awake and dressed, her dark eyes reflecting a determination that matched his own. She had obviously reached the same conclusion he had during the long, storm-filled night. "I am coming with you," she announced before he could speak. "Absolutely not," Jacob replied firmly. "You're injured, and it's too dangerous. Crawford and his men are expecting you to try something like this." "You do not know the way to the old trading post," Ayanna countered. "You have never been inside those buildings or seen how they are arranged. I have. My grandmother took me there when I was a child to show me where bad things happened to our people in the past." Jacob paused in his preparations, recognizing the logic in her words. He knew the general location of the abandoned trading post, but Ayanna was right about his lack of detailed knowledge. If he was going to attempt a rescue, having someone who understood the layout of the buildings could mean the difference between success and disaster. "Even if I agreed, which I haven't, you're in no condition for a hard ride," he pointed out, gesturing toward her bandaged shoulder. "My shoulder will heal," Ayanna said simply. "My sister's spirit will not, if we do not act quickly." Mrs. Chen, who had been listening from the kitchen, spoke up quietly. "Girl is right about knowing the place, also right about time being important." The older woman approached them with a bundle of supplies she had prepared. "You will need food and medicine. I have packed what you can carry." Jacob looked between the two women and realized that his decision had already been made for him. Ayanna was going to attempt the rescue with or without his help, and her chances of survival would be much better if he accompanied her. At least together, they might have a chance of success. "We ride in 1 hour," he decided. "But we do this my way, and if I say we retreat, we retreat. Understood?" Ayanna nodded, though Jacob suspected she would have her own opinions about retreat if they actually found her sister. He spent the remaining time going over his plan with both women, explaining the route they would take and the approach they would use to scout the trading post before attempting any rescue. The journey north took them through country that Jacob knew well, but seeing it through Ayanna's eyes gave him a new appreciation for the land's subtle features. She guided him along paths he had never noticed, routes that provided better concealment, and avoided the main trails where Crawford's men might have posted lookouts. As they rode, Ayanna shared stories of her childhood and her family, painting a picture of a life that was rapidly disappearing as white settlement expanded across the plains. Her father was a respected hunter and leader who had tried to maintain peace with the newcomers while preserving his people's traditional ways. Her mother had died in the cholera outbreak 3 years earlier, leaving Ayanna to help raise Winona and care for their aging grandmother. "My grandmother says the old trading post was built on cursed ground," Ayanna explained as they stopped to rest their horses near a small creek. Long ago, before the white men came, it was a place where our enemies would sometimes capture our people during raids. The spirits of those who suffered there never found peace. Jacob didn't put much stock in such beliefs, but he could understand how a place associated with violence and suffering would develop an evil reputation. More importantly, if the local tribes avoided the area due to these beliefs, it would explain why Crawford felt safe using it as a hideout. They reached the vicinity of the trading post near midday, approaching from the east where a line of hills provided good observation points. Jacob left the horses hidden in a grove of cottonwoods and proceeded on foot with Ayanna to scout their target. The abandoned trading post sat in a small valley beside what had once been a well-traveled trail connecting various frontier settlements. The main building was a two-story log structure with a covered porch that ran along the front. Several smaller outbuildings clustered around it, including a stable, a storage shed, and what appeared to be quarters for employees or travelers. Through his field glasses, Jacob could see movement around the buildings. At least 4 men were visible, including Crawford himself, who was sitting on the porch cleaning a rifle. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main building, indicating that the gang had made themselves comfortable in their temporary hideout. "There," Ayanna whispered, pointing toward a small window on the second floor of the main building. "I can see someone moving behind that window. It might be Winona." Jacob studied the window she indicated and caught a glimpse of a figure that could indeed be a young woman. The person seemed to be pacing back and forth in what was obviously a confined space, confirming that someone was being held prisoner in that room. "The stairs to the second floor are inside the building," Ayanna explained, "but there is also an outside staircase in the back that goes up to a small balcony. It was built so travelers could reach their rooms without going through the main trading area." This information was exactly what Jacob needed to formulate his attack plan. If they could reach the back of the building unseen, they might be able to get Winona out without alerting the entire gang. The key would be creating a distraction that would draw the men away from the building at the crucial moment. They spent the rest of the afternoon observing the gang's routines and mapping out their approach route. Jacob counted 6 men total, including Crawford, which meant they would be outnumbered 3-1. However, the element of surprise and their knowledge of the building's layout might even the odds somewhat. As evening approached, Jacob put his plan into motion. While Ayanna circled around to the back of the trading post, he positioned himself near the stable where the gang's horses were kept. At the agreed-upon time, he would create a distraction by stampeding the horses, drawing the men away from the main building, and giving Ayanna time to reach her sister. The sun had set behind the western hills when Jacob gave the signal by firing a shot into the air near the corral. The horses immediately began to mill about nervously, and Jacob fired 2 more shots to send them into a full panic. The animals broke through the makeshift fence and scattered into the darkness, their hoofbeats echoing off the surrounding hills. As expected, the gang members came running out of the buildings, shouting curses and grabbing their weapons. Crawford's voice could be heard above the others, demanding to know what had happened and ordering his men to catch the horses before they wandered too far away. While the men stumbled around in the darkness, trying to round up their mounts, Ayanna slipped up the back stairs to the second floor. Jacob could see her silhouette against the faint light coming from the building as she reached the small balcony and tried the door. The reunion between the sisters was brief and silent, but even from his hiding place, Jacob could sense the emotion of the moment. Winona appeared to be physically unharmed, though she moved stiffly as if she had been tied up for an extended period. Ayanna helped her sister down the stairs, and the 2 young women began making their way toward the extraction point Jacob had designated. Everything was going according to plan until one of Crawford's men happened to look back toward the building and noticed the open door on the second-floor balcony. His shout of alarm brought the entire gang running back toward the trading post, abandoning their efforts to catch the horses. "They're getting away!" the man yelled, pointing toward the back of the building where Ayanna and Winona were trying to reach the cover of the trees. Jacob knew he had to act quickly to give the sisters time to escape. He stepped out of his hiding place and opened fire on the gang members, his rifle shots lighting up the darkness and forcing the men to take cover. His first shot took down the man who had spotted the escape, and his second wounded Crawford in the leg, sending the gang leader sprawling behind a water trough. The remaining men returned fire, their muzzle flashes creating a deadly light show in the darkness. Jacob kept moving, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead of their shots, while continuing to draw their attention away from the fleeing women. A bullet grazed his arm, spinning him around and nearly causing him to drop his rifle. He could feel warm blood running down to his wrist, but the wound didn't seem serious enough to stop him from fighting. He found new cover behind a pile of old lumber and continued his deadly game of cat and mouse with Crawford's remaining men. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Jacob think that some of the gang had managed to catch their horses and were preparing to pursue the sisters. He broke cover to get a clear shot at the mounted men, only to realize that the approaching riders were coming from the wrong direction. 3 Lakota warriors rode into the trading post compound, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. Jacob recognized the lead rider as a man he had traded with several times over the years, an older warrior named Red Hawk, who served as a war chief for Ayanna's band. The arrival of the war party completely changed the dynamics of the fight. Crawford's remaining men found themselves caught between Jacob's rifle fire and the warriors' deadly arrows and lances. The battle was brief but decisive, ending when Crawford himself took an arrow through the chest while trying to escape on foot. In the silence that followed the gunfire, Red Hawk rode over to where Jacob was tending to his wounded arm. The warrior's painted face was grim, but his eyes showed respect for the white rancher who had helped rescue his people. "The girls?" Red Hawk asked in English, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Safe," Jacob replied, pointing toward the trees where Ayanna and Winona had taken cover. "They should be about 200 yards that way." Red Hawk nodded and spoke briefly to his companions in Lakota before turning back to Jacob. "You have done our people a great service this day," he said formally. "This will not be forgotten." As the warriors rode off to collect the sisters, Jacob looked around at the scene of carnage in the trading post compound. 3 of Crawford's men were dead, including the gang leader himself. 2 others had been wounded, but would survive to face justice, assuming they lived long enough to reach the nearest town with a jail. The ride back to the ranch took place in companionable silence, with the war party providing escort until they reached Jacob's property line. Red Hawk spoke privately with Ayanna before the group departed, and Jacob suspected that arrangements were being made for the sisters' safe return to their family. As they approached the ranch house, Mrs. Chen came out to meet them, relief evident on her weathered face when she saw that everyone had survived the rescue mission. She immediately began fussing over Jacob's wounded arm, while firing rapid questions about the details of their adventure. Later that evening, as Ayanna prepared to leave with a small escort that Red Hawk had left behind for her protection, she approached Jacob on the porch where he was watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and red. "I will never forget what you did for my sister and me," she said simply. "If you ever need help, you have only to ask, and our people will come." Jacob nodded, understanding that this promise meant more than any written contract or legal document. In a land where survival often depended on the kindness of neighbors, he had just gained some very valuable allies. As the small party rode away into the gathering darkness, Jacob reflected on the events of the past few days. A simple act of hospitality had led him into the most dangerous situation of his life, but it had also shown him something about his own character that he hadn't fully understood before. In the morning, he would need to report Crawford's death to the territorial authorities and explain his role in the events at the trading post. There would be questions and possibly legal complications, but Jacob was confident that he had done the right thing. The frontier was changing, and the old ways of life were indeed disappearing. But perhaps, in small acts of courage and kindness between people of different backgrounds, something new and better could be built on the foundation of mutual respect and understanding. Mrs. Chen emerged from the house with a cup of coffee and a blanket, understanding without words that her employer needed some time alone to process what had happened. As Jacob wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and sipped the hot coffee, he looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the clear night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight he was content to sit on his porch and reflect on the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing was worth any risk. The quivering Lakota girl who had pleaded for sanctuary had taught him something valuable about courage, and he suspected that lesson would stay with him for the rest of his life.